Hey everybody, I'm assuming that I'm streaming now, even though the YouTube's hasn't indicated it yet, because it's always delayed. Oh, and now it says it's starting. And my voice will be a little weird because I have a headphone on, maybe two headphones at some point, which is a little different than normally. Normally. Good use of English. Okay, so here's what's going on today. In case you didn't read the description or want more clarification on the description, this is going to be different. Not that much different. This is a watch me work video. That means that at some point when I stop talking, I'm just going to start working. And I'm just going to leave the computer on, and you can just like hang out and watch me do shit and see how workflow goes and all that. If you happen to be watching while I'm actually streaming, and you decide to chat something and you're not being obnoxious, I will chat back at you, either through the chat window or just look into your eyes. So, what's the deal today? The deal today is, well, normally I do filmmaking stuff, and that's all the posts that I've done so far with filmmaking stuff. Today, I'm going to be doing typography stuff. And some of you may be a little vague on what typography is. I'm designing a book. Typography is a subdiscipline of graphic design. Graphic design is a type of art that you're making. One of my original teachers basically described it as making garbage, because that's what you're doing basically. Graphic design is anything. A lot of it's packaging, which weirdly I don't have anything. Ugh. Here's some aspirin. This bottle was designed by someone who does sort of probably more of an industrial design look, but then all this logo and stuff up here and this label was done by a graphic designer. Packaging, obviously, people look at and they toss, which was the whole garbage comment. There's very little graphic design that's considered fine art or mainstream. You get stuff like Andy Warhol's little soup can bullshittery and all that, where he was basically just taking images and sort of blowing them up and doing a thing, pretentious-y thing. And then you get people that may occasionally keep something that they like that's kind of cool. There's a type of blended whiskey called Johnny Walker Blue that's like $300 a bottle, and it's okay. It's probably not worth $300 for a bottle, but the packaging kind of is. The bottle is very well designed. I was trying to look around to see if I have it within reach, but I don't. The box itself, though, is like this little Scotch coffin. Like, it opens up and there's like the velvet lining and all this stuff, and it has what you would call a perceived value, meaning you're paying $300 for something. You want to feel like you're paying for something of significance. It ties in a little bit like the line in Jurassic Park where kids were dicking around with the binoculars and the dude's like, hey, are those heavy? Yeah. Well, then they're expensive. Put them down. Right? So you want to have a sense of something when you get like this Gorilla Pod thing, and if the legs were kind of loose and weird feeling, you'd be like, you want them to feel kind of burly. So one of the easiest ways, in my opinion, that a manufacturer of goods and services can impress people is you put something in a nice box, or you have a logo that looks professionally designed. A lot of logos don't, and I'm not going to call anybody out here at the various junk that's around my house here. But and some people don't know the difference. It's an eye training thing, just like any type of art and all the rest of that. So some people don't care about logos so much, even though there's like the Nike logo is the famous example. Like everybody knows what the Nike logo looks like, and they paid somebody very little money to do that logo, and then I think eventually had to go back and like pay her more money because it was one of the most recognizable logos in the world, basically. But you can think about almost anything around in your life. Tide detergent has a very distinctive sort of bullseye motif, which is different than the Target bullseye thing, right? Which is a very different thing. And McDonald's has a very distinctive logo. McDonald's is a really good example. You can always tell if there's some old McDonald's that was back in your town and then went out of business and it's now a fucking convenience store or some other thing. You can recognize, a lot of times you can recognize that building. 7-Eleven is the same way. You can recognize that building, even though it's a completely different business, as something that used to be a McDonald's or used to be a Taco Bell or whatever. There's just something about it. McDonald's on top of that not only has their very distinctive their M, but they have a very distinctive color of yellow and a very distinctive color of red. I'm not sure, I haven't done the research. Some companies will essentially trademark the color or have as opposed to a general CMYK color, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, black. It's basically the 4 colors we use to mix to make all the other colors in printing, where on your computer monitor it's RGB. And then we could get into a whole side thing about the difference between additive and subtractive color, but we're not. But a lot of companies for print stuff or whatever, they'll do what's called a Pantone color. Pantone is a company that creates colors or has very distinctive color that would require you to buy a jug of their color in order to use it in printing the ink. You couldn't just take the CMYK and mix them together to create that Pantone color. There's something else in it where you have to use what they call a spot color, which is very expensive. And McDonald's, I know Blue Cross, their blue is like a Pantone color, I'm pretty sure. So I'm going to guess that McDonald's probably does as well, but I don't know for 100%. But what they definitely do that doesn't require any sort of added colory stuff is they use proportionality of color in a very distinctive way. So the amount of that yellow and the amount of that red. So even if you were to design a business using the yellow and the red that McDonald's uses, you could theoretically stay out of trouble, even if it was like another burger restaurant, if you were using mostly the red and a little bit of yellow or vice versa. Like, you would look at kind of how McDonald's uses those colors proportionally. For example, on the screen here in this Patreon logo, the amount of red and the amount of white is a thing. And it's not just that these words could be bigger. You know, in McDonald's case, they may have that M in the middle of whatever their red is, and the amount of red on the outside of the restaurant itself or on the menu boards inside or whatever. All of that shit is planned on a company that big. At least it better be. I'm also checking the thing that's uploading too, so there'll be slight distractions in that way. And I'm going to listen to music when I start working, because I do that normally, and then when I talk to you guys for like an hour and don't get to listen to music, it gets all antsy. Not really, but a little bit. Oh, and I actually started something here, so I'm going to turn this off for a second so I don't have to. I'm listening to ELO's Time, which is a very not super well-known album of theirs from, I'm guessing, early 90s. It might be the late 80s. Oh, no, it says here 81. So, gosh, that's early 80s. Anyway, ELO is known for a lot of things, and Time, the Time album is not one of them. So, anyway. All right. So, graphic design embodies a lot of packaging art and a lot of postery, propaganda kind of art, and just things that sell stuff. And a lot of graphic design is type. And within type, there is typography, which is a very specific set of rules and disciplines to be used for type. And that's the thing that most people could give a fuck about. And honestly, a lot of companies could give a fuck about it either. You would be amazed at the amount of bad typography in the world should you be trained in typography. Even to the point, and this is known in graphic design circles and maybe a little bit outside of it, it almost may reach the mainstream. James Cameron, who is I believe a former graphic designer back in the day, I might be thinking of Ridley Scott though, Ridley Scott definitely was, but James Cameron used a font called Papyrus for the Avatar stuff. And it was just a fucking joke. Like, he was using what in the graphic design thing is like just like this, the same level as like using Comic Sans for like a band poster or whatever. So it's the idea that a dude that spent $250 million or whatever the fuck Avatar cost to make, and then signs off on his graphic department essentially using a free fucking junk font that you would use on your goddamn report on fucking hippies in fifth grade, not fifth grade hippies, but doing a report in fifth grade about hippies. And you'd be on the internet in middle school being like, oh, that fucking papyrus font looks cool. It's so cool. And using that for like your $200 million film logo thing is just ridiculous. And it's funny when you hear, when you get graphic designers alone in private, you talk to the person that had to do the graphic design for some avatar display in a local museum or whatever, and they're just like, oh yeah, it was fucking horrible, like having to deal with like this stupid ass font. And it's all a different kind of nerdism. It's kind of like the DC Marvel comic dudes arguing back and forth or figuring out which fucking Batman costume you like better. It's nerd as shit. But with typography, there also is an element of usability, readability. I don't want to say science because that's a little strong. Definitely tradition and all the rest of that. So I do a lot of typography, multi-page typography, which is different than doing like poster typography. And you have typography where you're designing logo-y stuff, like Todd's logo here. This is a logo type, meaning that he has used type, but he's used it in a way that it becomes basically a logo. He probably added this little doodad on the K. He might have messed around with the letter shapes in a little different ways. I'm not sure. Evertide with its weird little color bands on here, that's essentially a logo type. When you take, my iced tea hasn't kicked in yet. When you take type and you essentially turn it into a logo, like McDonald's M, for example, and it's still a type form, but it's also being used as a logo for something, then that's a thing. Or you just use type in a very certain way. I'm assuming he probably pulled this Patreon thing off of Patreon. So Patreon is using whatever this type is here, a specific sans serif, which means sans serif means it doesn't have the little doodads on the end of the letters, right? So if you look at this E, it's got this little up hook right here. That's a serif. And this E has no serif, so it is sans serif, meaning no serif. Yay, typography lesson. Most of you know like the difference between leading, even though you might not know what leading is called, but leading is the space in between two lines of text, right? So this right here is leading, and it literally came from back in the day when they were using type presses. They would take pieces of thin lead and stick them in between the lines, and that's what you were stacking. Each letter had its own little letter form in lead, and then you stack them on top of little leaded lines. And so the leading, how far apart those lines are. Kerning is the difference, the distance in between letters, right? So these are very narrowly kerned. These are a little more kerned. And then kerning is the thing that typography gets super fucking nerdy and weird about in a lot of ways, because once your eye kind of learns to, and what you're doing is, as a typographer, you're not looking at a letter. You're not looking, this doesn't say Patreon to me necessarily. It's a series of objects, like a tree, like you'd look at a tree, and then you're looking at the negative space in between the objects. So it's almost like a magic eye test, right? I'm not seeing an R, I'm seeing this little patch of red and this little patch of red and the distance of this little leg and the little bowl of the R here and all the rest of that, right? So when I look at this, it's pretty good. I'm a little, this might be a little wide. It's probably not though. It's probably just a trick of like the angle on my computer and all that. But to me, like the negative space in between these, if I was to complain about it, it would be this space between this P and this A right here. It's just like slightly off. So that's how weird and esoteric you can kind of get to shit. Um, all right. So Todd Lockwood is a fantasy artist. He's the guy that I mentioned in the little description that I made here. And Todd Lockwood does a bunch of stuff. I originally met Todd when I worked for Wizards of the Coast down in the corporate offices. And I got brought in by a woman named Mindy who worked for Five Ring Publishings. So, oh, I got a runny nose. That's gross. Five Ring Publishing had done a game called Legend of the Five Rings, which was basically a kind of fantastical samurai game that came in the wake of Magic the Gathering. And I'm not going to get the origins of Magic the Gathering. You can fucking Google that yourself and look at all that. But I started working at Wizards around 2000 as part of them buying out Five Rings Publishing. And I was helping Mindy do some stuff back in the warehouse, organize things. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons, on the other hand, since 1970 some fucking thing. Advanced D&D were the first books we had, and at the time those books were being released like a month basically apart. So you'd get like the player's handbook, and then you wait a month and get like the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you wait a month to get the Monster Manual. Then you could actually play the fucking game. And so we literally were waiting for the Monster Manual, I think for sure. So we didn't start in the original old school, super old school box set, but we essentially started with what's called first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And so I've been playing that forever. And so working at Wizards was pretty awesome because they bought TSR, and I'm walking around and I'm like, oh, I know that guy's name, and I know that guy's name. And I walked over and met Skip Williams, who was an author who had done a bunch of stuff in Dragon Magazine when I was a kid, and that was all very exciting. And at one point, I was walking through this warehouse, what I think was a warehouse, but they were keeping Todd Lockwood and Sam Wood back in this warehouse, essentially, and they were doing concept stuff for third edition Dungeons and Dragons, which I worked internally on, not like on the design element part of it. I worked on some of the customer related stuff where people were writing a lot of hate mail. Basically, they're like, fuck WotC for buying TSR and trying to put out a new third edition game, blah, blah. And I was like, second edition D&D came out like 15 years ago. Like 15 years ago. So they waited, and we're putting out a third edition now. You're going to be fine. Like, you have to buy a new copy of fucking Call of Duty like every 18 months. So 15 years is a pretty good stretch for a game system. On top of which, of course, and this is the thing that is most hilarious about when new shit comes out. When new shit comes out, it's not like the old shit vanishes, right? It's not like the second edition books, like all the words were going to disappear on their fucking books and they were going to become blank or whatever. It's like, you can still play second edition, man. Nobody cares. Just go do what you want to do. So that was a lot of my life, was sort of answering third edition hate mail. And then very rarely, I don't want to make this sound like it's more than it is, I would very rarely sit in on design meetings and just kind of hang out and not even really offer too much stuff, because those guys were pretty, Jonathan Tweet especially is pretty hardcore math guy. So, I remember being in on a meeting where they were talking about the differences between, and this is all D&D nerd shit that you can look up if you care, where they were talking about whether or not rolling a natural 20 for a crit and getting ×3 damage versus 19 to 20 crit and getting ×2 damage, like whether that math worked, whether it was equivalent. And I'm like, I'm not a math guy, right? So it's like, people like to roll dice. I don't give a shit. But it was cool kind of being part of that process, or being part of into that. And I did, goddamn sniffy nose. And I did do a bunch of playtesting stuff. Like, we would just be like, hey, we need to test this thing, fucking 2-weapon fighting or whatever. Come make a character and do a thing. It's like, all right, that type of deal. So that was Wizards, and that's where I met Todd Lockwood. So Todd Lockwood started out as a commercial artist, meaning he was drawing posters back when they used drawings for posters, and maybe he was doing like magazine ads, and he was doing a lot of product type stuff basically. And Then he figured out that he could do fantasy-based material. Stupid itchy nose. What is going on? He could do fantasy material and do these kind of, oh, I'm pointing at the screen again, do these kinds of paintings and actually make money out of it. And that's what he started doing. And Drizzt is a character that he became attached to. Drizzt is a drow elf who, there's a series of books that were written about him, and he was very popular, or is a very popular character, and Todd did a lot of the artwork for the books. So that would be one thing that Todd is probably pretty well known for. Another thing would be dragons. So Todd did a bunch of D&D work, excuse me, did a bunch of D&D work for 3rd edition concept-wise. Bunch of sketches, bunch of different monsters. Him and Sam were back there just fucking drawing monsters all the time. And Todd was a traditional painter by training, and then he was one of the first guys that I knew that sort of had switched over to a program called Painter. And I'm not sure now if he still uses Painter or whether he uses Photoshop. I think he's comfortable in Photoshop, but he usually was like a Painter guy. And he goes back and forth still. So he knows how to paint, and then he figured out how to digitally paint and sort of recreate that kind of stuff. I'm not sure what this has to do with the D&D bit, but for some reason my mind went there. But of all the D&D design work that he did, the fucking dragons are the things that sort of took off, right? And we'll go ahead and click on his site here and see if my internets will open up. There we go. Freaked me out for a second because I have the monitor to the side, which has me in the little inset square and my monitor, what you're seeing, basically. And so I saw it sort of come up over there, and I was like, the fuck? Oh, yeah, that's right. So, as you can see, there's a fuckload of dragon art on this website. And some of it goes clear back. There's the 3rd edition Red Dragon. Very classic piece. Right. Little guy running down here. And there's, of course, a shitload of sketches and stuff that went with this as well. That's another 3rd edition dragon. Bring back up here a little bit. These were for one of the Dragonomicon, I think, which was a book that, let me check and make sure. Oh, no, that's a different one. That says The Labyrinth of Drakes. There was a book that was called the Dragonomicon that came out, although I think that had a lot of reprinted art in it, too, because D&D kind of recycled stuff a little bit. There's a little dragon egg with a dude popping out of it. So, anyway, he became very well known in the D&D community for doing dragon art. He's done a shitload of it. Most of it is pretty fucking cool. Actually, all of it is pretty fucking cool. He has a way of designing dragons that look like they have some anatomical design underneath the skin, so they're not just like a fucking winged lizard, the same winged lizard every time, because they're not, because he designs the underneath bit. He helped, or he basically designed the visual look of the iconic 3rd edition characters. There's some of the dragons you can see for that. These are for, this was on a module, I think the Apocalypse Stone maybe, which was Chris Pramus and some other guys. That's got some red hair there. This module I have, which is pretty cool. This was on, I don't know what it originally for, but it's on a drow adventure that I have. There's a module. Anyway. So yeah, so that's a bunch of Dungeons & Dragons stuff and Dritz. And then he went on to do some magic art, which I'll pop up open here. And there's a bunch of Magic the Gathering paintings. Most of which, I don't want to say most of which, a lot of which were probably commissioned by Jeremy. There's a buddy of mine, Jeremy Jarvis, he's kind of the franchise director now, but he was the art director for a long time. I was working on a contract, actually, when he commissioned this. And I don't remember what the set was, but I was basically doing typography for the Magic Style Guide that gets sent out to the artists each year. And that was pretty much the only time I did that, which means I probably did a bad job. Or there was some, no, there might have been some cost stuff involved, or I don't know. I didn't get along with somebody. But regardless, Todd, so that's part A of the story, basically. So Todd had done an art book called Transitions, and which is pretty cool. And it's got a bunch of his art in it, and some of the stuff that you've even seen here, and then it's got a bunch of type and all the rest of that. But it came out in, fuck all, who knows? Copyright 2003. Holy shit. So yeah, that was a long fucking time ago, and he's done a lot of stuff since then. Actually, he's done a lot of really, like, this mostly has older stuff in. So his newer stuff, obviously, because he's an artist, gets better. He also did this kick-ass little dragon dude here with a little signature when he sent me the book, which is awesome. So Todd decided to do a new book, and he's been talking about this for a while. That's a side note, though. So in the meantime, I'm doing graphic design for this fantasy science fiction convention called NorwestCon in Seattle, which is this dinky little thing that's basically kind of a writer's convention. And they have a program, one of the little multi-page magazine sort of stuff. And there was a guy that had been doing that since the beginning of the days of the convention. And he was an older guy, and I wish I could remember his name because I feel bad that I don't. And he passed away. I didn't know him personally, but he passed away, and they basically had a year or two where they were just kind of scrapping shit together. And I would go to the convention, and it finally came to a head maybe the second year in, where I was looking at this program, and I was like, man, you could tell somebody had just, I'm sure they worked hard on it, but there was spelling errors, and the layout was clearly somebody that didn't have the background in layout, and it was just some poor fool that had like volunteered, I'm sure, to be like, I'll do this because nobody else will. And I was like, all right, well, I've been going to this thing for a long time. And there was a few years back in the day where I'd kind of ghost it, which means you'd sort of show up and not pay the membership fee and just kind of hang out at the convention. So I felt like giving something back. So I volunteered to start doing the program for NorwestCon. And I did. And I did that for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, whatever it's been. Took the last couple of years off. I may start doing it again. Haven't decided, depending on whether they ask and all that too. But Todd was a guest of honor at one of those NorwestCons, and he really liked the layout that I did for the NorwestCon program. He liked the typography because he'd be educated in that way. So a few years ago, when he started thinking about doing this book, he was basically like, hey, I want you to do the book. I'm like, sure, that'd be great. And then a couple of years later, he'd be like, hey, I want you to do that book we were talking about. I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. And then he emailed a couple months ago, and he was like, hey, I want you to do it. And I'm like, that's fine. And then we should meet up and talk, because he was serious this time. And I was like, oh, shit, okay. So I went and visited his house, and we hung out and talked about stuff. And then we've been exchanging emails back and forth. And we did the most important thing you can do in business, even between friends. We signed some contracts, wrote out and signed some contracts. So now everything is on paper regarding, what he expects out of me, what I expect out of him, which is mostly pay. And I had been wanting to work on this for the last couple of weeks now, but a whole bunch of film shit and some other stuff had gotten in the way. And now, finally today, I get to start working on it. So, or I get to start really getting into the nuts and bolts in it. I've been kind of working on it off and on. So that's where you come in, where you can now watch me do this thing, and I'll talk you through some of it. So say goodbye to Todd's pretty work. This is toddlockwood.com. I suggest that you, what the kids knew, bookmark, do something. His Kickstarter hasn't started yet. And I will more than likely have a video up that'll have a link in it when it does. But Todd's website will, I'm sure, as well. I'm not sure if Todd is on like Twitter and Instagram and whatnot. I'll check to see if he's on Instagram, because he should be. I'm on Instagram, which I think there is a link in my videos normally, but it's just DQNIEL Kaufman, although that's just me smoking cigars mostly. But that Instagram has a link to my it's Pulled Proc. So Pulled Proc has an Instagram and a Twitter and whatnot, and I'll post stuff up there as well. But honestly, checking Todd's site is the smarter thing to do. So this is InDesign. InDesign is a program that Adobe makes that a lot of people don't use because they'd rather just use Photoshop to do stuff. InDesign is specifically made for multi-page documentation. So as you can tell here, I have multiple pages. And down the side you can see here's the little page palette, and that's this is right now, we're not sure how long the book's going to be, but we know it's going to be at least 300 pages. So what did I do here? 352, which is a really fucking awkward number actually, and I'm going to change that right now. So one of the things that's gonna, I don't want to say suck for you, but anybody that's watching this, if you've watched my other stuff, there really is interesting and good information. It's just sprinkled throughout me sort of like bullshitting and talking about stuff. So I guess that can be a little bit of a problem because I don't usually have the time to go through and like time code, here's the part where I talk about this, or here's the part where I talk about that. So it's probably better off to just put me in the background and be like working on something yourself. And then when you hear something that's interesting, go, oh shit, okay, and make a little note or whatever. But books, printed books, come in what's called signatures. And so, for example, find a hardback if you're in, and if you look on the edge of the hardback here, you can kind of see that there are little mini books in there, basically. It's a certain number of pages, and they take those pages and they fold them and create a little signature block. I'm trying to find, okay. So like if this was a book spread, then you'd fold this over, and maybe this would be like 6 or 7 pages, and it would create its own little thing, right? And then you'd take another one, and maybe that'd be 6 or 7 pages, and you'd fold that over, right? And then you'd stack them together. And if you're hand binding books, which I've done, you're taking beeswaxed thread and a needle, and you're literally sewing, you're poking a hole through this little spine, and then going over to this little spine, this little spine, this little spine, and you're making a little cross stitch or whatever you're doing. There's different kinds of stitches, and you're stitching them together, and then when you get a little stack of them, that's when the hardback part of it comes in, right? That's when this thing with the little spine and all that. And so these pages, I'm going to be real precise here, which may take a little bit more of a moment because terminology on this stuff is kind of important. So this bit is the book block, which is the printed book. It is the book block. These, this and that, and this and that, those are end papers. Those are the things that connect the book block to the cover. And then this, of course, is a dust jacket, which goes onto the cover to help protect it. All right, so that's what happens. So these little end papers, basically, this one gets glued. This one gets glued down to the hard back bit. This is all set up here, and this is set up here, and these are usually a different texture. I don't know if you can tell on the webs, but these are slick and glossy and kind of thin, and this is thicker and matte colored. And you can do all kinds of stuff with the book block as well. Or, sorry, with the end papers. But the end papers need to be a separate document. And I'm explaining this because that's kind of what I'm going to work on today, initially, actually, is the end papers. So, yoink. But these signatures, they're called, which are little 8-page groupings that you're stacking together. That's what originally got us onto this point. By the rules of printing, by the way that printing works, you want to usually try to get those into multiples of 4 or 8, usually 8, traditionally 8. So a 200 or 352-page book, is it a multiple of 8? I don't know. I'm not going to do the math. All I know is that we need to have at least 300 pages. and the closest over that I think that I talked about with Todd, because I have a little post-it note, little electronic post-it note that has a bunch of shit. 324 is definitely appropriate. So I'm going to come down here, and there's a little, oh shoot, I've used this program before. Where did my pages go? There they go. Okay. What InDesign tends to do by default for some reason, and then of course it updates itself and then goes back to default. But I want to allow pages to shuffle, spreads to shuffle. Panel options maybe? Medium, shuffleness. There, that's right. I got to click off show vertically. Oh, well, that worked for the master pages. Let's try it again. I'll turn those up for now. Yeah. Oh, well, fuck me, I guess. There is a way to get all of these to kind of be all over the place instead of just a thin vertical line, which is what oh, there we go. Horizontally. There we go. All right. So kabam. Now we've got a whole bunch of fucking pages spreads set up. And so what I'm going to come down here is I'm going to grab 324, which is right there. I'm going to grab 325 down to 352, and I'm going to put them in the trash. So now we're 324. So that's approximately the number of pages that we'll end up working with. And then I'm going to take this little pages doohickey. I guess I want properties too. And as you can see, like a lot of this stuff, I haven't worked in InDesign in a little while. Stop it. So that's why, and I haven't worked on it hardly at all since I've gotten this big ass monitor. So that's why some of this stuff is like, why don't you already have this set up? And it's like, well, I should already have this set up, but I don't. There we go. It's one thing I like. You guys know that I do a lot, or anybody that's watched this know that I do a lot of DaVinci Resolve and Fusion-y type stuff. They have not gotten on the bandwagon yet as far as customization for their interface, the way that Adobe has. So being able to move all this stuff around and all that is pretty cool. So there's a few other things in here that I normally would try to clear out for space, but to be honest, I don't really need the space that much right now, so it's fine. So what happens with what you can do with InDesign is you can set up what's called master spreads, basically, or master pages, which are these, and they have the text stuff on them. And then when you go down into here, as you can see, this master page here is basically this master. This is the master page. That master page is applied to all of these pages. So when I want to do a chapter heading page, which I've sort of already designed, I grab this, drag it down to there. Now it says chapter, and now when I go to page 8, it's a chapter page instead of a master heading page. See? That's how that works. So one thing I'm going to check while I'm here. So Todd and I basically got together and decided on a font, which is a form of Adobe Caslon. And that's what this is. So as I highlight it here, yoink, Adobe Caslon Pro, regular. There it is. These are what's called small caps, which are those kind of short little capital letters. And then this is basically a descriptive block for each of the paintings that will show up. And I'm not sure if this is the final bit, but it's a process, right? We have come up with one that we like, and then when we start laying the book out, we'll figure out whether it works or not, and then we'll change it if we need to. Some of his works will be copyrighted by Wizards of the Coast, so I'll delete this out of the ones that aren't, or potentially just, actually I'll just do that right now. I'll create a second book block, or a second little descriptor without it, and then I can just delete the box as opposed to going in and having to delete a specific line out of a box, right? And then the title of each painting will be adjusted, right? Some of them may be kerned out this far, some of them may not, based on how many words there are and how it looks. Space between here to me is a little weird, so I probably should adjust that. That might be a little tight. The issue is, too, I'm using what's called basically like a baseline grid. Whoops. There we go. The letters and all the whatnot are set up to go upon this grid. So the reason you use a baseline grid, which a lot of people don't know, is because pages are transparent. Right? When you hold them up to the light, you can kind of see through them. It's not as big of a deal for an art book, but for a book with text in it, it's critically important that you can't see the lines. So text on backside, text on front side, right? My fingers being lines of text, the space in my fingers being space in between the lines. If you don't have a baseline grid, this happens. So then when you're looking and you go to turn the page or whatever, you can kind of see the text through the back of the sheet, which is kind of janky and can mess up reading, you know, if you're doing that thing where you're kind of holding the page up or whatever. So you want this. You want the text on the back of the other text, basically. And that's what the baseline grid guarantees, that the text on this page is lined up with the text on that page. So that's what that does. And you do it usually in an increment of the leading. So this text, for example, is 11.5, which is a pretty good size for hardback text with 15-point leading. So I'm going to guess that I set these up to be 5. Yeah, no, actually I didn't. So whatever I set them up, I might have set them up to be 3. 3, 6, 9, 12. That's what I did. So it's a multiple of the leading, right? So you look where this line is, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. 15-point leading from here to here with breakdowns of 3-point spaces, basically. So I can make it every 3 blah blah blah. So this, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's 12. But because this type is small and this is large and italic, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's 15 here. So that's what was kind of going weird with this. And I am hitting Alt and pushing down, and that's what basically allows me to drop it this way, which is so awesome that it's annoying when I'm working in Illustrator or Photoshop or Premiere and it doesn't do that. As far as I have to like move a space slider or whatever. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now when I turn this off, W, it looks too tight to me. But then this also looks a little too spacey because of how big this is, even though it's equivalent to this space. So this is going to be a thing that I'm probably going to wrestle with. That's too tight. All right. And this is typography, really. Whoops. It's a lot of weird micromanaging. Oh, one other thing before I actually start getting to work. typography-wise, yeah, here it is. This is the book. It's a book that I started on. It's a book that a lot of people start on, and it's basically rules. It's The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst, and it is a whole book full of typography rules, basically, and guidelines. And it talks about things like line length. For example, that's the number one thing you see in people that haven't studied typography is you'll see a line of text like all the way across the page, basically. That's probably not a good example. Trying to find something here real quick that isn't some sort of wacky confidential bullshittery either. And I can't, but you get the idea. Well, let's look at this Eating Well book that I have. This is pretty well laid out. This is on the edge right here, right? Like that's about all the longer you'd want. If they would have started this recipe here and the recipe goes clear crossed, that's bad because you get what's called eye fatigue, and right about here you start wanting to kind of skip down lines and it just makes it harder to read. So they have this nice 2-column layout. They have big obvious headers. They have hierarchy in text, meaning you can kind of tell this is assertive dressing like this, but this is flavor text essentially. So as I'm reading it, I can learn to go from here right into the recipe and skip that because I know at a certain point that it might not be important, or it isn't important unless I want to read some sort of descriptive blah blah blah. This borders on too long for me because of the bold and the fact that it's an ingredient. I might have bumped this down a little bit, like right in here, because that kind of pokes out too. But in general, this is pretty well designed. So that's all the rules and things that Bringhurst talks about, like how many characters before shit starts going awry, and how big should your header be compared to your text. And this is all things that I'll begin experimenting with when I really get into the nuts and bolts of stuff. We're kind of in the broad strokes phase right now. So it might be a case of this title is also 11.5. Usually the fact that it's small cap is enough to sort of set it apart as a title, but it might be that I come back in here and decide that I want this to be larger, and that will sort of take care of the weird little gap thing that I'm looking at from an optical standpoint. The other thing you can notice here that I do, which is a thing that I don't see a lot of, but I like doing it, is we always assume that text has to be black, meaning 100% black. This text here is, as you can see down here, is actually 80% K, 80% black. The title is 90%. That's 60, and that's 40. So basically what I've done is instead of using color is a really good thing you can use to kind of establish hierarchy. I've used degrees of black. So it's very rare that I use 100% black text. It's almost always 80 to 85. What that does too is allow me to, instead of using bold font, which sometimes kind of pokes out a little garishly if I'm trying to be elegant, if you're using an 80%, I don't know if you'll be able to tell on the monitor here, but we'll try it out. So if I wanted this word to be bold, I could bold it, which basically means I could come down here, grab regular, turn it into bold, and now, boom, that's fucking bold, right? Or if I wanted something a little more elegant, I might bump it up to 90, and then you can kind of see it's a lot more subtle, but this basically just became a little bit more darker, a little darker. And I could even go up to 100 or 95, I guess. Try 95. So that stands out actually quite a bit there. So 80 to 95 is 15%, or this is clearly darker. So print it out on a page looking at it in a block of other text, that's going to pop out. So that's one of the other ways to kind of create text hierarchy. And text hierarchy is, I've been saying the word hierarchy a lot. Hierarchy is training the reader's eye to go the places you want them to go. It's the same as visual. When you're watching a movie, the director clearly wants you to look at whatever he wants you to look at. With text, it's like, how do you want the eye to go across that page? What blocks of text do you want them to engage with first, in what order, that kind of stuff. All right. So, no, not quite yet. I've got some delicious, delicious chicken cooking. So at some point I'm going to hop up and be like, fuck you guys, I'm going to get chicken. But for right now, let's do this. I'm going to put on my headphone. And I'm going to start working. And I'll kind of tell you what I'm doing. If it's worth getting into the details, I'll get into details. Again, if you're here while I'm doing this, I will, in theory, engage with you in chat if you're asking good questions. Otherwise, if you want to obviously leave comments down below, I'll try to answer them. And there you go. That's it. So I am going to set up a page for the end papers that we talked about, the things that are at the beginning and ending of the book. So I want to try to match my title, for file management. So Found Worlds Todd Lockwood version 1 becomes me fucking that up. There we go. Found Worlds End Papers version 1. Picas. How did it get on Picas? So 11.5 is right. We only need 8 pages. Bleed is how far the ink goes off the page in the file to make sure that the printer, when they trim it, that the ink goes all the way to the edge. For example, this isn't black paper, it's printed black. I'm guessing it's not black paper. And so you want it to come clear up to the edge. That had some kind of bleed, so that it was printed out to about here and then it was chopped off, basically. I should probably use Todd's book for more examples. I have a little note to the side that tells me how much bleed the printer wants, which I believe is 4 millimeters. But I'm going to double check. And I'm listening to the Prometheus soundtrack. A movie that I liked, though I understand people's problems with it, but it has good music. There it is, 4 millimeters. All right, so that's probably pretty close to that, but I'm going to use the exact printer specification so that he can't come back at me and be like, you didn't do exactly what I said. So, all right. Okay. We're good to go. Now I'm going to make sure the chat window. There we go. All right, so end papers isn't necessarily going to be super exciting. This first page here literally gets glued to the hardback, and this last page here gets glued to the hardback. So if I want to do anything, it becomes this. So what I'm going to do here is, just to mess around with some ideas, I'm going to go into a big old folder of Todd's work. proxy files. Good. All right. Oh shit, that's huge. I can't actually be. Oh, well. The direct select arrow allows me to get this little brown thing, which means I'm affecting the image inside of it. And then scale. There we go. Fitting content to frame. Yoink. Yeah, this isn't any good. What I'm trying to basically do here is find an image that would work good for end papers. I want to try to find a black and white image. And of course, I have some organization on this stuff, but we haven't like fully got into it. So there's a difference between kind of a sketch quality image, I guess, and a there we go. Is this gonna work? Nope. Todd does black and white, or has done some black and white work. And the black and white, when you're doing a black and white illustration, you're putting a lot of detail into it, which might not be appropriate for what I want to use this for, which is basically like wallpaper. Those are all vertical too, which is weird. Oh, because they're magic cards. So what I'm trying to find, what I'm trying to find is a sketch more than a finished black and white drawing, which is a weird distinction. But what do we have here? I'm not sure if there isn't a reason that I can't be showing this, but I mean, it's basically just my computer hierarchy, which doesn't matter too much. Make it a little more exciting for you, but all right. So this right now is proof of concept, which means I'm doing the equivalent of a thumbnail drawing or a sketch. So I just stretch that up, which I won't do normally because it'll make it all kind of fuzzy and low res. What I'm trying to basically do is just be like, hey, would it look cool to have a dragony thing, right? At the same time, even though it's not going to be final, I got to find something that represents the concept. And that means I need something that has texture or pencil markings and whatnot all the way through it. Or I need to zoom in on something. Oh, let's try this. Oh, and it's is it Control D? Yeah, Control D basically opens up a little side window off to the side here, and that's what you use to grab images and do what's called placing in InDesign. There we go. The other thing is the way that InDesign keeps track of scaling is different. If I was to scale the image based on the blue outline, I would be changing, let's see if I can do this right. It would reset itself to 100%. And then I wouldn't actually know how far I'd scaled something. Whatever I scale it down to becomes the new 100%. I need to learn the shortcut key for this, Control-Alt-E. Where doing it with the little hand tool where you've got the brown outline, then the percent, when you come over into this massive mess somewhere and find whatever percentage it's shrunk at, which might be this 50 here, yeah, zoom level 50, then it stays relative to how you shrunk it, so you can come back and know, oh, I already shrunk that thing this, or expanded it that, so therefore if I do it again, this happens, which usually is bad. So this is better because it's kind of filling up the page. It still isn't going to be what I use because I'm not going to have words and all the rest of that in here. But what's going to happen is, there we go. By clicking this little Edit Original, I'm going to be able to open this thing up in Photoshop. And then I'm going to be able to add a layer. Oop. Oh, this is gray. So I was trying to figure out why I couldn't add a hue and adjustment layer, and this has been saved as a grayscale thing. So I used to know how to do that. Oops. Oh, it's mode. Yeah, it's grayscale. So I'm going to turn it to CMYK. And then I'm going to be able to add a layer to it. So what's going to happen with the final is whatever image this is going to be a process image from Todd, whatever the cover is that Todd does. So if Todd does like a big old, phoenix doing some crazy shit, my hope is that I'll be able to get a process drawing from that and use that on the inside covers. And then no, that's no good. And then we'll adjust it color-wise to kind of match whatever's on the cover. Right, so if it's green, it's green. Chances are it's going to be warm, like this. So now I'm going to relink this because I basically had to save it as a different file. Oh, for fuck's sake, and I have to do this. There we go. Had to search for it. Ah, boom. All right, cool. Now we got this, right? And then we come over here. We drop the opacity down to maybe like 20%, maybe 35%, maybe 50. And then we'd experiment, or Todd and I had talked about having a book plate, basically. So that would be the general idea. We'd basically take a piece of art, and this, again, it's a proof of concept. This is not a finished thing. Even I'm looking at it going, this is junky. but it's basically it's a thumbnail. So, or the equivalent of a thumbnail. So we'd have some sort of piece of art that matches the cover, and then some sort of little plate or thing in here that would be designed, probably with some intricate borders and cool shit, that we could kind of lay on here so that Todd would have a space to be able to draw or autograph any sort of selected copies. And that idea I like. So that is a thing, and that would go there. And then actually, to do this proper, we do a copy, and then we do a Shift Control Alt V for paste in place. And now they match. And then these two, these would be left blank intentionally. Save. All right, so that is a thick, rich hour of your life that if you made it all the way through. I'm gonna go get my delicious chicken. I don't know why I did that part of it. That kind of fucked things up for a second. Hey, optional features, learn more. All right, so yeah, I'm gonna go get some lunchy lunch, and then when I come back, I will turn this back on for part 2, I guess, which will just be more of the same, and that'll just be me basically working. So, all right, thanks for making it this far if you have.